Okay, we're live. I tried to record this video before and ran into a couple of problems, but I think should be sorted now. Okay, so here's the problem that I want to try and help you all solve. And this is a question that I got asked from a friend that I'm helping with some Quasar related stuff. Imagine you've got an app that's got a home page, and not just a home page, but kind of like a few sort of classic website stuff where you got your about page, your landing page. So landing page, let's make that text a little bit bigger. You got your about page. And then, I don't know, something else. Maybe like a register page. So something that does have to make a request to a backend. So let's call this the website. Maybe I should have put website in quotes there. And then often you'll have the rest of your app. Especially for new devs, this is a really common structure, especially when they're creating something where they just want to show the world their first project or their first few projects. It'll be a home page, like the website that tells you everything about it, and then you've got the web app. And then, here there's going to be like tons of pages, lots of pages. And then the problem that we've got is SEO is really important for this part, making sure that this is all easily discoverable by Google. This is all about, page optimizations, making sure we get a good score in Google, making sure that everything sort of responds quickly. But then you've got the web app where that is less important. This is more about sort of the functionality. People don't mind if this takes a little bit longer to load. Web crawlers aren't going to be accessing this part because you would log in before you even see this page. And in fact, that's a good point. You would also have the login page in here as well. So let's create a bit more space there and add in the login page. And so the question is, hey there, Luke, will you publish vue.js to log in for Quasar via Supabase again? Yes, not for a while. So, I wish I could talk about this now, but I want to keep this stream to this one topic. Long story short, there's a whole ecosystem of packages that I'm working on at the moment, and I'm kind of I haven't taken the time to switch back to vue.js. So vue.js is still, to my knowledge, is still in alpha or beta. So it's going to essentially get a bit of a rewrite based on all of the things that I've discovered. For example, I didn't even know how to do TypeScript properly when I first built that. So there aren't even any types. Even though it's written in TypeScript, the types aren't exposed, which is just ridiculous. So there's bits and pieces like that need to be fixed. I mean, we can use with npm via vue CLI. Via vue CLI? Oh, okay. So that's a bit of sort of backwards compatibility because vue CLI isn't really used anymore. Okay, maybe we should have a chat about that. Feel free to hit me up on Discord. That's my Discord, QuasarCast. And we can sort of chat about that so I can get a better idea of what you mean. Okay, so anyway, this is the problem. We got the website, we got the web page, SEO important, SEO less important. So let's have a look at these two apps. And I first want you to understand the difference between SSR apps and SPAs and how they kind of tie into this problem here. What is that? That's my Discord account. So to talk to me on Discord, that's kind of like how I chat with people in the community. And Discord's an app that it's basically just a chat app. A lot of people use it for gaming, but it's also used in the web world quite a bit now. So Quasar has a Discord channel, for example, where you can chat about Discord. I think that's what you meant by what is that. Okay, so let's have a look at this setup that I have at the moment. I'm going to shut down these two servers, and I've got a basic app here, and we're going to run it in dev mode as an SPA. So that opens up my server in SPA mode. And if I do Control U, so that we can look at the source of this, this is what Google is going to see when they first jump into this app. Google, let's imagine that it hasn't run any JavaScript yet. And oh, by the way, that's the other problem. So Google can index SPAs, but it's still a big question mark of how good it is at that. Otherwise, a lot of people would just be building SPAs because they're far simpler to deploy, which we'll talk about in a moment. Um, but because Google isn't so good at indexing SPAs, or at least there's a question mark at how good it is at indexing SPAs, that's why people are moving to SSR. And by indexing SPAs, essentially what I mean is we don't know how good it is. That we don't know how good it is at reading your JavaScript and then using what your website becomes after that JavaScript is run. So notice, for example, we've got a subheading here, but in the source page, if I do a Control F and I search for subheading, it doesn't come up at all. This is one of the downfalls of an SPA. Essentially, the JavaScript that gets run here in the source, that's what ends up building out all the elements in our page. That's what ends up building out the DOM tree. So what we see in our app when we're developing is all of these elements, right? We can see the subheading, we can see the main tag, the page, the drawer, all of that is visible to us. But again, this is not visible to Google until it runs JavaScript. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, if we do an SSR application, Quasar Dev Mode SSR, SSR stands for server-side rendering. In other words, rather than the front end rendering all of our app, okay, so we get some JavaScript and all of these elements get rendered on the front end, the server is going to render our app. In other words, the back end or your machine, that's up in the cloud, it does a lot of this work up front. And therefore, okay, so this is our SSR app, our server-side render. Server has already rendered a lot of this HTML for us. And it turns out that gives us a few performance benefits, which I'm not going to go into in this video because that goes out of the context of what we're talking about here. At the cost of two things, at least in the context of, again, in the context of this video, deploying it is a little bit more complicated and a little bit more difficult to scale. Okay, it's harder to, at least in theory, to scale an SSR application. And secondly, it can be harder to develop as well. So you'll find with SSR, often things just run quite smoothly and it works well to begin with. And then you start realizing, oh, hang on, I've done this wrong. Or hang on, I haven't loaded my data first. And therefore, or I haven't loaded my data correctly. And therefore, the crawler, the SEO, the Google crawlers can't crawl it as well as they thought that it could. So that's one of the problems with SSR applications. It does add more layers of complexity. And I don't like building in SSR. I don't think anybody actively wants to build SSR apps, at least in the context of Vue. They choose to build SSR for some of the benefits that they get. I don't know, I could be wrong about that. Let me know in the comments if there are some reasons that you actually prefer SSR and you enjoy building SSR more. But usually SPA is a little bit simpler. SSR adds a few complexities on top, but gives us some of these benefits. Okay, so now in this SSR app, let's just say we got this subheading. I'm going to copy that and come back here to our source. Control F, and we can see now that Google can see this subheading up front. It didn't have to run any JavaScript, and it can simply see that subheading. Now, from the context of Google, you might think, all right, Google can just run the JavaScript on the SPA version, and then it will see that subheading. It will then be able to dive into the DOM and see it. And look, that's probably true, but as your application grows and the structure and complexity of your app grows, and maybe you've got some tab components in there and different tabs show different data, eventually it reaches a point where Google just isn't as good. It isn't as smart at indexing that page. So it might have difficulty being able to read it at that point. So this is one of the reasons that you might want to choose an SSR application. And the other thing is it is a little bit faster, and it means that when you're using something like Cloudflare, all of this can be cached. So we can cache all of this HTML, meaning that when the user hits the server, boom, straight away they get the entirety of the website. No JavaScript has to run. And that makes Google very happy. Google goes, great. And it makes it easier for Google to preload your site as well. So I'm pretty sure Google's doing some stuff now where before you even click on a link for a website, part of that website's been preloaded. I don't know if they ended up doing anything with that, but there's all these little bits and pieces that Google can do to give us benefits. Now, the other thing is meta tags. So again, it's basically the same problem. If we come back here, I've got a page here called some blog post. And if we go to routes.js and then go to some page, it takes us to that some blog post file. All right, so let's go to /some page. And notice inside of here, I've got some meta tags. So specifically, we have this description tag that gets added. The name of it is description and the content is page 1. So let's copy that page 1. And now inside of our SPA, if I do Control-Shift-I and we look through here in the head, we should have a meta tag somewhere here. I'm not sure exactly where it puts it. Here we go. And there's our page 1 content. So if you need to add a little bit of extra information to Google, you can do that using this Quasar composable that we get out of Quasar. So we can say description and add a little bit of information for the crawler. Now, it's the exact same problem here, where if we now view the source of that page, Control F and look for page 1, we can't see it. So Google has to do extra work to discover that meta tag. And now let's go to the SSR app and go to /some-page, Control U, Control F to find that meta tag. And it's a little bit messy. It's not kind of lined up nicely like these other meta tags. You can see it's actually just been thrown at the top here. But there we go. We now have that meta tag showing by default. Again, it's easier for Google to see. And it's questionable how much of a problem that is. But because Google can run JavaScript. But from the context of, again, from a CDN, this all just gets cached by default. And therefore, Google is likely to give that a better score because it can just go, boom, I've got the HTML, boom, the user can read it really quickly. Therefore, I'm going to give you a good score because for very little effort, the user was able to get your entire site and all the information needed for that site. Okay, so hopefully that kind of helps you understand why an SSR application is often chosen and why people get hyped about SSR apps. There are some other benefits as well. So for example, you can prefetch a bunch of your data and then get all of that data injected into the body of your app. So from the user's perspective, they don't have to do a bunch of backend requests. The server might do, for example, 5, 10, 20 requests on the server itself. And therefore, because it's close to where those requests are made, it can get that data very, very quickly. And then when it serves that data up to the user then just gets that data straight away and doesn't have to do a bunch of backend requests themselves. And then another thing you could do is, again, cache the result of this page with something like Cloudflare. And then Cloudflare is going to, maybe refresh that cache every half an hour, for example. So it doesn't have to go hit the back end, do those 20 requests every single time. Therefore, with an SSR application, we can get some serious speed benefits at the cost of a bit of complexity. Now, with all of that context in place, let's talk about why we might want to use SSR and why we might want to use SPA. So again, the biggest benefit to me for an SPA and why I avoid SSR like the plague is that it's easier to deploy and there is less complexity with an SPA app. So when I'm building very data-heavy applications, I don't get the benefits of being able to cache all of the data. Backend requests have to be made anyway, and they have to be fresh. That's paramount. And therefore, I don't get a lot of the SSR benefits when I'm building my app. But when I'm building my home page, this is super important. So that's why for the website, I like to choose SSR. And then for the web app, I like to choose SPA. So in other words, I like to have or PWA, but this is kind of the same sort of thing. PWA's basically, a PWA basically is an SPA. PWA stands for Progressive Web App, and all it is a group of technologies to bridge the gap between an app for a website app and then like an app on your phone. So it's basically a group of technologies to make websites more like apps. At least that's how I like to think of it. Progressive web app. We're progressing towards it being more like an app. And then there's like TWAs, which is basically a PWA that can be installed from the App Store, but that's a whole other conversation. So PWAs, SPAs, and later on, actually, I'll talk about it now. The other one we've got is actually SSG, and this is also great for websites. Now, SSG is available to Quasar with an app extension. And an SSG is kind of like what Vite does behind the scenes. So what Vite does, to the best of my knowledge, is when you build a Vite app, not Vite, sorry, Vite Press, I really should specify that. When you build a Vite Press app, it runs an SSR server. So it runs your app as an SSR. Then it hits all of the links on that SSR and copies the HTML to files. And then it saves those files, and that's what you deploy. So basically, you end up with something like an SPA, so something that's more static, so that you can deploy it very easily. So rather than having to run an SSR server, essentially it's like copy-pasting all of the links within that SSR, which is why we call it server-side generated, or I think that's what it is, SSG. SSG stands for web dev. Server-side generated. Static site generation. Okay. So basically, you end up with a whole bunch of HTML files that get generated from your markdown. And the only reason it's got that SSR step is to basically get your app running with all of the right meta tags and all that jazz. So there's an app extension for Quasar that does something like this. And maybe in the future we'll get something official, I'm not sure, for Quasar that does static site generation. And to my knowledge, I'm not really in the Nux world right now, but I think Nux is also looking at doing something like this. Maybe they already have, I'm not sure. So you've also got static site generation. This is great for things like blogs, because blogs, the content isn't changing a lot. And when it does change, it goes through this process of essentially running your app as an SSR, getting all of the files within that app, and essentially copy pasting it, like creating a static site, which is just a bunch of HTML files, CSS files, etc. No server required. You can just whack it up on something like Netlify, and it's really easy to just run it in that case. So this is where SSG is really good. And if you can do SSG here, then that might also be a really nice option for you. Okay, so now hopefully a few of these concepts are making a little bit more sense. Let me just read this comment. Oh, should I join there to join community? Yeah, totally. You should totally join the Quasar community. In fact, I'll quickly mention this. If you go to the Quasar website, I think on the home page, there might be, yeah, here we go. If you click on this button here, that's how you get into the Discord community. So we can all chat and make friends and stuff like that. So you can see there's a lot of people there. We've got over 1,000 people there. And in my experience, it's pretty active. There's like 3 or 4 people that are part of the core team that are in there regularly asking questions. So that's kind of cool. Okay. So having said all of that, and maybe I should have mentioned this earlier on in the video, I often prefer to just build these pages, especially if they're marketing related, with an external service. And I know some developers might sort of, turn their nose up at that, but I would rather just use something like, if it's very marketing heavy, I would just use ClickFunnels. That means that I can split test these pages really easily. I'd put it on a domain like this, For example, mysite.com would be my domain name, and let's just change the color of that maybe to like a purpley color. And then this would be app.mysite.com. You've probably seen a lot of this. Google does a lot of stuff like this where they use subdomains, and then you've got the main website for Google. So for this, you could just say mysite.com. That's done with either ClickFunnels, SSR, SSG, blah, blah, blah. And then essentially you run two servers, or you use a service like ClickFunnels. So you would have a server that runs your SSR app or SSG app, and then you would set up your DNS that points to that server, and then you would have something else that then runs your SPA. So what I would do is I'd probably run this on something like Netlify or Cleaver. I think that's what Quasar recommends, something called Cleaver. And then you would run this with something like Netlify, because it's so easy to deploy with something like Netlify, or what's the other one, Versal, whatever the cool kids are using these days. And then you just have both. And it also creates this really nice sort of separation in your app. And it means that if you want to choose a different technology to build your website, that's really not so difficult to do. But again, I would use something like ClickFunnels if I'm doing lots of marketing stuff and I need to do split testing. Or there's nothing wrong with using something like, what's that other one? Let me go. Build a website. Yeah, something like Squarespace as well. This, or Wix, that's the other one. Squarespace, Wix, even if you're a developer, there is nothing wrong at all with using these technologies, because usually these pages, or WordPress as well. WordPress is another good one. Except you might get a little bit of slowness with WordPress that you wouldn't get with these other tech. There's nothing wrong with doing that. And the reason that this is a good thing is because a lot of SEO is just built in to these tools, and they make it really, really easy to work with SEO. And a lot of them are, pretty inexpensive, especially if you're hosting your own WordPress site. So that can be a first thing to look at, especially early on. Rather than optimizing straight away by building your own SSR or SSG, just find a drag and drop tool like this, like one of these, and build your homepage on that. Nobody cares. In fact, the people you're working for are probably going to love you for it, because then they'll say, oh, great, I can come in here and make changes as I need to. Or if they're a marketer, they will love it if they can come in here and easily do split tests. Because I guarantee you, you do not want to be dealing with working with split tests as a developer. That can be an absolute nightmare. And then, often you try and create tooling by creating your own sort of mini CMS that is exposed to your users, and it's just not worth the headache. I really think it's better to just use these technologies at this stage. Okay, so that's the other thing. Let's talk about deploying now. So the other big problem with an SSR application is that it's a little bit harder to deploy. So one thing you might want to do to deploy this and make it fast is, so if you run your own server, let's just imagine you've like Volta / DigitalOcean / AWS, whatever. If you run your own server, then you will probably want to use something like Cloudflare to do caching. And the reason you want to do that is if you have a server, and this does depend. If all of your clients are in America, for example, or I'm in Australia, I have some sites where everybody is in Australia, or I just whack it up on a DigitalOcean or Volta or whatever. And then it's there, and then everything works, and my database is close to all my clients, so it's just not an issue. But if you have something that is sitting in a database in America, right? And then, so let's just say your server is in America, and then somebody from Australia, that's where I am, believe me, I've had this problem before, wants to use your service. So they go to your website, let's just say that it's mysite.com. And this might be obvious to some people, but it's not for a lot of new devs, especially when you've got all this other stuff to think about. They hit mysite.com, and then it sends them over to America in order for them to get to the server. So this is the problem, because I'm now going to get, for example, like, I don't know, 400 millisecond times, 400 milliseconds just to hit that server. So that's kind of untenable. And then you might go, okay, well, I'll just create a server in Australia, and then maybe you're working with a database, but then I have to hit, my site then hits the server in Australia, which might be really fast, but then it needs to hit the database in America anyway. So then you might have to start doing things like database replication, and it's just not worth it. So this is where this can cause problems. And so what you'll often want to do if you're doing an SSR app is adding a Cloudflare cache. And you can basically say, hey, Cloudflare, I want you to cache this, and like recache it every 30 minutes, right? So then when Australia hits mysite.com, it goes through Cloudflare. Let's demonstrate this a little bit better. So you can imagine this is, yeah, it hits mysite.com, and then it hits Cloudflare, and then Cloudflare goes, oh, I don't have this, I don't have a cache of this, and therefore I'm going to go to America, and then I'm going to, it hits the server, and then it goes back again, and it's slow, right? But once it's got a cache, so once it's done that the first time, it goes, I'm going to cache this, and therefore it doesn't go slow, because the subsequent calls within that 30-minute period are going to be pulled directly from the cache. And therefore, because Cloudflare can cache this all over, because it's got caches all over the world, you're basically going to get fast speeds everywhere on the planet. Okay, so that's kind of an idea of how you might want to deploy this then. Just use something like Cloudflare, learn how to set up the caching, and then no matter where you are on the planet, even with an SSR app, it's going to be fast. Obviously, or maybe not so obviously, this does not work with an app where everything needs to be very live, okay? So if I need something that the moment it's updated, I need to get that new data. You can't have a user create something, refresh the page, and then it not show up for 30 minutes. That's untenable, which is why we would then split this up between an SSR app and then an SPA, PWA, etc. Yeah, however, having said that, you do still have this problem where your app is going to be slow. And this is, I've talked about this at length, and I might kind of go out of scope for this video. Actually, I'll talk about it quickly because it'll be interesting. So let's just say, I might just do this from scratch. So this is done now. I've finished talking about the website side of things. This is how you make your website quick. You add this caching layer on top of it, and this means you get all of the benefits of SEO because Cloudflare is cached. You can imagine now Cloudflare caches your HTML file with everything in it. That cache gets refreshed every 30 minutes, and that means that no matter where you are in the world, you're going to get the latest of that and it's going to get served up very quickly. Okay, that's enough of that. What about your other server, app.mysite.com? Now, early on in your project, since this is a difficult problem to solve, you're probably going to want to solve it just within one region. So if you're in America and you're building a website for America, then you probably just want to have a server that's in, I don't know, I think some of them are like New York, for example. So let's call this our New York server. And then let's imagine that the person hitting that server is in New York. And then maybe we'll call this our DNS. So I'll even call this, how about DNS and then in parentheses, Cloudflare, or whatever you end up using to manage your DNS. So in this case, we would say, do not cache, all right? I think by default, Cloudflare won't cache. So this is very important because we want to say, when I hit my server for mysite.com, that's the part we're missing here, app.mysite.com, right? Then our DNS, which is on Cloudflare in this case, is going to say, okay, this isn't cached, therefore we have to go to the server every time so that we get fresh data. So when we're making API calls, and in fact, I'm going to change this to API, because often what you'll do, see, this is another level of complexity here worth mentioning. You've got app.mysite.com, but then you would also have, for example, api.mysite.com. And then the entirety of the app, I would then set up with something like Netlify. So then, let's say here, New York, Australia, and then they're going to app.mysite.com. And then let's just say the DNS. Honestly, what I would actually do is possibly use Netlify at this point. Probably don't have to write do not cache at this point. And then Netlify is going to be the one that serves up the website. And then Netlify basically has a global network. So global network. And all of these assets here for your SPA or PWA are going to be served up globally with Netlify. So Netlify builds your app. Whenever you deploy, it will build your app and it will make it available all over the planet. And that's easy for Netlify to do with an SPA because all it's doing is basically copy pasting your static assets. So in other words, copy pasting stuff like this, and then this JavaScript file, and then, you know, your icons and your CSS, wherever that is. Right? So all of that gets copy pasted all over the globe, in Australia, America, blah, blah, blah. And therefore, when we hit Netlify, it serves up our app very quickly because it's copy pasted all of those assets all over the globe, right? And honestly, in this case, maybe you could also use Cloudflare. I like to use something like Netlify because it handles all the caching and nonsense for me so that every time I deploy it, I know that my new assets are going to be served up all over the globe. Okay, so that's that part. But then what we would do is we'd say this app here talks to our API, which is sitting in New York. So it's kind of interesting where whenever you go to appmysite.com, you're hitting, for example, something like Netlify. But when you go to api.mysite.com, you're actually hitting your server in New York. And in fact, I'm going to get rid of the Cloudflare thing here. That's probably just complicated. Basically, we're saying it goes from New York to your server in New York. Now, this means at this point, everything is fast except for one. We have one bottleneck now. This is all fast, loading our homepage. This is fast, loading our SPA, because there's assets for our SPA are available all over the planet. And by the way, you could replace Netlify here with something else like Cloudflare Pages. There are, if you want to go all in on Cloudflare, you can do whatever you want here. There's a few services, or Versal. I'll put even, let's do this. Versal, Cloudflare Pages, just to give you an idea of all the technologies that could be. All right. So that's all fast as well. But this is not fast because no matter where you are on the planet, let's just say I'm in Australia, everything loads quickly for me until I start dealing with the API. When I deal with the API, I'm now going to the New York server. So I now have to do this, however many milliseconds. Let me just exaggerate it a little bit. In fact, this might not be an exaggeration. I might have to spend 600 milliseconds to hit that New York server. And then all that data that I get from, all the JSON data I get from that is going to come back slowly. And I'm going to be doing these kind of requests regularly. So you're regularly fetching data in applications, and that creates a really low experience. In fact, I have this problem with Basecamp. So when I used Basecamp a while ago, I'm in Australia, and Basecamp does SSR for everything, at least to the best of my knowledge. That so every time, pretty much every action you do is hitting the Basecamp servers wherever they are. Now, when I used Basecamp, there were no servers in Australia. So every single action I did, even opening up a menu, was hitting a server over in America, and I couldn't use Basecamp. It was untenable for me as someone in Australia to use Basecamp. In America, I'm sure it's totally fine and everything's like snappy and awesome. For me, it was awful. I couldn't do anything without it being super slow. And I listened to their podcasts and stuff like, Hey, for their email client. I'm like, this sounds awesome. I'd love to use it. But I'm worried if I use it, it's just going to be ridiculously slow. So this is a real problem for making something global. Okay, so we hit our API. What do we do about this, right? This is the problem that I call this the real scaling problem, because this is the one that actually is quite difficult to solve. SSR is a pretty easy solution. SPA is a pretty easy solution, but just to make this video complete, I wanted to give you a bit of an understanding of how you might want to solve this. Okay, here we go. The way I'm currently thinking about solving this is having multiple servers. So I would serve my site to multiple locations such as New York, Australia, and the real world example we have right now is we're scaling to Africa as well. Okay, so we got our site in a server in New York, Australia, and Africa. In fact, let's just say America here at this point. So you can have something called, I believe it's called a global DNS. At least that's what I'll call it here. It's called like Anycast, I believe is what the actual technology is. So let's call it that. So you then have this Anycast IP address. And what that does is it delegates, let me just get everything in the right order here. When we go to that website, we have a special IP address that it delegates to. And this IP address figures out where the person is in the world, and stuff like AWS and Cloudflare support this concept. And they send you to the right server. So we got IP addresses for all three of these, right? They've all got their own IP address. And then it delegates and then sends you to the correct server. So if I'm in, let's say, America, and the other one is Africa. Sorry, I really did not need to type all of this out. If I'm in Australia, I hit that website. It sends me to this Anycast IP address. So I'm going to get there very quickly because it's going to, this is basically a highly available IP, I guess is what you could think of it as. And then it delegates me to the IP address in Australia. And therefore, this flow is quick. So I've removed the bottleneck of going from mysite.com directly to America. I now go through this essentially proxy, which then takes me to the closest server to me. Now, that all sounds great, but and there's two ways you could then solve this. You could say, for example, API-Australia. So you could have a separate server for each site, and then a separate database as well for each site. This is one way to do it. And I believe Amazon does something like this. If I go to Amazon.com, hang on, what happened there? You know what? It doesn't matter. You get the point anyway. If I go to Amazon.com, then I get a /au in my URL. So I'm not entirely sure about this, but my guess would be that Amazon is essentially, oh, hang on. I've just explained a different concept here. Oops, sorry. I might have confused you guys a little bit there. So, All right, this is one way of doing it, and then it sends you to the American, Australian, Africa server, etc. The other way you can do it is have multiple servers and then add a prefix inside of here. So API-America. Sorry about that confusion. Oh, this is why I got confused. They're switched around. API-Australia, etc. Right? And this means you can you have a very easy direct route to your server. Now, the downfall of this, and maybe this is actually a good thing in your case, the downfall is that you now have 3 databases. Okay, so now we've got to introduce a new concept here, which is your DB. And you're essentially deploying 3 different versions of the app that are completely separate from each other, and they all have their own separate database. That can be problematic. Sometimes you may want people to be able to talk to each other across, no matter where they are in the globe. So if I'm in America, I want to be able to send a comment or whatever, and then the person in Australia see that. But if all of these servers have their own database, then that doesn't work. Unless you do something really funky where you kind of send something from one database to another and blah, blah, blah. But that's not how you would do it. Databases aren't sort of set up that way. And so this is the other way we can do it and end up with one api.mysite.com URL. Okay, but just know this is available. And this makes sense for a lot of people. They'll just have different URLs. So for example, app.mysite.com, and maybe, I don't know, it's app Oz, or maybe you can do some sort of Anycast. I don't know if Anycast supports this, but maybe you can do something like that. And then if they go to this site, then they get a version of the SPA, which has this URL built into it. The Australian URL built into it. So therefore, if they go to the Australian version, they get the app that takes them to the Australian server. Okay, so everything is isolated in this case. And honestly, conceptually, it's kind of in some ways, conceptually, this is easier. You just deploy your service 3 times every time you deploy. And if you're using something like Laravel Forge, is what I use for deploying, it's not too difficult. Or this is why Docker can be useful as well, because it means that you can easily replicate things to all of these different servers. Okay, but what if you want to have one database for all of these? The problem is we now have this problem all over again, where we go, okay, I'm in Australia, I go to this address, Anycast is super smart, so it knows where I am in the world, so it sends me to the IP in Australia. So I've just gotten from here to here very quickly. But now, let's say DB in America, now I have to hit my database in America and then go all the way back again. So I might have added, I don't know, somewhere around like 800 milliseconds, depending, onto my request. So, which is ridiculous. I could do all of this maybe in like, I don't know what's realistic here, but maybe like 10 milliseconds, or let's just say 20 milliseconds. And then I have to do 800 milliseconds because I'm doing this massive round trip to go all the way to America because I'm fetching data from the database. So the entire concept has just been completely destroyed just because we have a database involved. This is really a really annoying problem, and one of the most frustrating ones I believe to solve. Now, this to me is the solution, and I'm going to show you how to solve it for a database, but you've also got to essentially do the same thing for your caching layer as well if you have caching, which is why it might be a smart idea to only add caching when it's necessary in your app if you want it to have an API that's global. And please keep in mind that extra little bit I added. If you want an API that's global and fast, and that's super important to you, right? So, and otherwise, just if that's really important to you, you want to offload your caching to later on and handling all that stuff later. But this is a very unique problem. Often people will just replicate their server. So this is something where you might have like a social network, for example, where you just have to have a database that's shared across people all over the globe. Okay, so what do we do about this? Well, what we do is something called database replication. Man, this video's gone way off the rails, hasn't it? We're now talking about something completely different. So what you do is you have your master database in America. And then I'm not going to tell you exactly how to do this because, that's a bit of a process. But then you have a DB. We'll call this a replica DB in America. And then we've got one in Australia as well. And Africa. I should have just done 2. So now what happens is whenever we want to, and this is something you need to do in your framework. Laravel does this out of the box, which is really nice. It's got, some easy ways to do this. Now, if we hit the database and we're in Australia and we're fetching, how am I going to organize this? Maybe like that. That might work. So if we're fetching, then we just go to the replica. And the idea is whenever this database changes, all of those changes are sent into the replicas as well. So you never write to your replicas. Replicas are only for reading. So whenever stuff is created, it gets sent to your replicas. Now, that's great, but it means that when you're fetching data, you can just go directly to the replica. But when you're creating data, you then go to the master. Okay, so let's just do that and change that to creating. So let's go through this again. I'm in Australia. I hit api.mysite.com. Anycast is smart enough to know where I am and figure out where to send me next. So it then sends me to this IP address, which is in Australia, so that I get there quickly. So we've just gone from here through to here quickly. All right, and let's just say I'm getting some posts from the back end. Since I'm doing a fetch, it sends me over to the replica, and I get the latest posts. And the delay here is pretty low. I think it's something like 200 milliseconds or whatever. I think somehow they're able to get extra speeds here. I'm not actually sure exactly how that works, but it's within seconds. Within a few seconds, any changes here are going to update there. So my data here is technically going to be stale by maybe 1 or 2 seconds, but that's not a big deal for my site. All right, if somebody does a post on something like Facebook, and then I don't get that post showing up for 1 or 2 seconds, that's okay. It's rarely a situation where this needs to be truly live. And if you have a request where it does need to be truly live, then in your code you would say, by the way, fetch this from the master. Okay, so we go to Australia, we're fetching, we go to the replica database in Australia, and then it all goes back through the chain, back to Australia. This is great. Everything is running quickly now. When I'm creating, however, we are still going to get that delay. Since it's happening on the back end, it might end up being a little bit faster. So let's just say it ends up being, I think in Africa, we're getting speeds of about 600 milliseconds here. So that's only going to happen when we're creating. And usually in apps, people don't mind so much when they have to wait a little bit for a create. And there's things we can do in the UI to make things faster with a create. So we can do optimistic things in the UI for a create. You can't do optimistic UI when you're fetching data. It's impossible, because if I don't have my posts from the backend yet, okay, so let's just imagine in the UI here, I want to show a list of posts. There's no way for me to show any of those posts until I've done that fetch from the database. But if I create something, I know what's going to be created, especially if you're using UUIDs, which is one of the reasons UUIDs is becoming popular. I can now say, okay, I'm in Australia, I'm creating something, here's the UUID, and it can, in the UI, I can immediately just close out the dialog or whatever and insert that data into the page. So if I've got a list of posts, right, and then I create a post. Before this request is even made, I can straight away send that post into that list of posts because I've already got the description. I'm using UUIDs. I've already got the ID of that post. I've already got the title, every single bit of data that I need to throw it basically into that list there. I don't need to wait for the response for it to show up inside of this list. And then if there is extra data, I can then wait till I get that response back and then insert it in there if you need to do a little bit of an update to that data. Okay, so this isn't a problem. By the way, it's not just create. This is also slash update slash delete. And all of these things, creating, updating, deleting, can be optimistic. So this is how it's possible. These are the technologies that we can use to make all of this possible, to have an API that is fast. And this is one of the revelations to me. The fact that all of these events don't actually need to happen immediately because we can have optimistic UIs. And there's one more thing I want to add here, because for all you advanced users out here, I think you will find this interesting, these concepts. The other thing is we can put these actions into a job. So we can say, for example, so this is the Australia server, create job for things that we want to get a response really quickly. We've got this thing where we do fuel transactions, and when a fuel transaction, if we request to create a fuel transaction, so somebody's pumped fuel and their phone says this is how much fuel was pumped, and they send that to the server, we want a response quickly. We want their UI to be snappy. Chances are they're out in the sticks. That's what we call it in Australia, out in the sticks, out in the bush, out with this bad reception. And therefore, we want a response back really quickly. And our particular problem is actually in Africa. So what we might do is, for us, this is called a transaction. If you're doing a transaction request, we're going to create a job that then sends that data to the master database. And the cool thing is, the moment we want to create that transaction, we can send that job and then immediately go back and tell the user that, yes, we accepted that job and therefore that transaction is going to be created. Okay, so we want to make sure that we get that data and then it's sitting on our server. It's very important that we don't lose this data. So part of creating that job might be saving it to the database in Australia as well. So we might have a replica database, but then maybe we might have like I don't know, let's just call it sensitive jobs database as well. So now we can have this second database that essentially creates the job. So if anything screws up here, we haven't lost the data. We've still got it sitting inside of this kind of secondary database. So there are other ways that we can deal with this problem, where we can basically say, let's create for stuff that we want to create really quickly. Maybe there's some things in your app that people are constantly creating all of the time. You can then create a queue of jobs that then goes ahead and sends that to the master database. And it means that we can say, I hit the server in Australia. I want to create a transaction. It fires off a job. This is all happening quickly because we haven't done any round requests to anywhere else. Everything is inside of Australia. So Australia, transaction, create job. We get a response straight away back to our user, right? Down this chain. And that all happens within a few milliseconds. And then this job, we don't care if this takes, that could take, for example, I don't know, 30 seconds. Maybe it's like clogged up. So we've got a big queue there. That could take 30 seconds and it doesn't matter. We don't need, for our transactions, we don't need immediate reflection of those transaction changes. So then that transaction hits the master DB. The master DB then syncs that with the replica in Australia, and then the admins on their dashboard might not see that update. I mean, more realistically here, this could be like, 1 second. So maybe they get when all is said and done, 3-second delay of when that transaction is created. Who cares? That totally doesn't matter, and it's not an issue for just about any application. If that's really, really important to you, then you could also have another job that sends off what do you call it? Uh, a WebSocket event, right? So then that might hit something in a WebSocket server. Um, or actually, honestly, you could probably have your WebSocket server, depending on your setup, in Australia. And then that create job could do two things. It could send it to the master database so it gets created, and also send a WebSocket to our WebSocket server, which then tells, oh, actually, this wouldn't be the database. I'm getting everything confused now. Where does it say? Yeah, I'm getting lost here in the sea of things. So that create job, um, actually, no, you do it here. So when you're creating the transaction, you could also send off a WebSocket event, which goes back to your Australian server so the people in the dashboard can see very, very quickly when that transaction is created. Now, this is something you would almost certainly not have to do. The only reason you would do this, I reckon, is maybe with logs. So maybe you want to see logs really quickly. I mean, honestly, even then, we're talking about a couple of seconds here. But if you've got some logs that are running on a device that's out in the field and you want to see those logs really quickly, maybe you create a log and then that log hits the WebSocket server and then quickly tells the admins in Australia or the developers in Australia, hey, this is what showed up on the device inside of the logs. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can scale these applications. You're almost certainly not going to have to worry about any of this architecture stuff. It's very unlikely that you're going to get to that point. Um, and I mean, I don't know. I don't know what you're building, but if you're building, this is kind of, I'm making $1 million, and therefore it makes sense for me to do this. Okay, that's not entirely true. So I work for a startup at the moment, um, that is doing pretty well now. It's only, it's kind of been drowning underwater and is now kind of poking its head above and the water, and it's starting to really get some traction now, and it's starting to do well. And we're talking about moving to Africa. So for now, we're just going to leave our servers in Australia. All of our clients are currently in Australia, and we're just going to let them cop the 600 milliseconds. It's not a big deal. And the way we're going to handle it eventually, though, is make it so that Africa essentially follows this process that I'm showing here with the logs and what was originally transactions. So um, our users in Africa for now, 600 milliseconds. Like you have to really think about priorities here. It's more important for me to be building new features. We've got a massive user base in Australia. We got probably in the thousands now of transactions that are happening every day as people are pumping fuel. We've only got maybe like, uh, I don't know, 3 or 4 transactions that are happening a day in Africa because it's only just starting out. I don't know what the actual numbers are, but it's not a lot. It's a fraction of our current user base. Even if we were getting like 50 transactions a day, they don't. And the other thing is our app is designed so that our transactions can be sent in the background, so they don't block the user. So whilst that transaction is being created, especially if they don't have internet at the time, we send that into a queue and we send it later on. And so why would we put all of this focus into saving a few milliseconds when it doesn't really benefit the user at all? The only downside is that an admin who has a dashboard in Africa has to wait 600 milliseconds rather than, 20 milliseconds for their dashboard to load their transactions. And they might go in and view that once every 3 days. Why would I put all of my effort into this architecture right now? Now, later on, we're going to have people in Africa, possibly in other parts of the world. I probably shouldn't talk about that just in case, you do some Googling and find out where I work. And technically, I might be, breaking some rules by telling you this. So I won't tell you where else we plan on going. Actually, to be honest, I don't really know. But, you know, let's just say we go to America, to China, to India, blah, blah, blah. And so we need to create these extra servers. In that case, sure, why not start introducing some of these concepts? But the other thing to consider is to create these replicas. I could do that myself, but it's going to reach a point where it just makes more sense for me to use something like AWS Aurora, which makes it really easy to have a master database and replicas. Or Superbase can actually do this. I was surprised to find out Superbase has some competitive pricing for having a database and replicas. I think DigitalOcean does this. I know that Volta does this as well. So we're going to have to pay. Honestly, it's going to end up being over $1,000 a month once we grow to that scale, in order to hold all of that data, and that pricing is only going to go up. And so why would we put all of this extra money into creating these replicas when so that we can save milliseconds? So again, if you're in a social network kind of website, this might make a lot of sense to build out an architecture like this once you start going global. But like, think about your priorities. If you have 90% of your customers in America and you're spending a shit ton of money for the other 10% of your customers, and the other 10% of your customers is in Australia, Africa, India, China, and they're like all over the rest of the world, then you're going to be spending a crap load of money on these replicas so that your social network is a little bit faster for that 10%. It doesn't make sense. Like, focus on building a really great product for your 90% of your clients, and then when you start to grow, and then that 10% ends up being like, 5,000 users, 10,000 users. If that 10% of people in other parts of the world is a large chunk of your users, then yeah, start thinking about moving to this concept. But again, don't forget, this is really important, don't forget that this structure also exists. If you don't have this kind of like social network, this network structure that is important, where you've got somebody who needs to, there's kind of two situations I can imagine here. One of them's a social network, and one of them is kind of like somebody who's managing a global economy of data. So for our fuel thing, we've got a reseller that's managing data that's going to be global, right? They're going to be selling these all over the globe. So if that's happening, then this kind of a structure might actually make sense for us, because we want them to be easily able to query across places all over the world. But that is rare. Most apps, it's totally fine for you to isolate, to have different databases. And in fact, in many cases, it's preferable to have different databases for different places around the world. And it also means that your databases are going to run faster. When databases grow, you then need to start thinking about using something like timescale so that your database runs faster for different kinds of data. And you can kind of push having to deal with that back by using an architecture like this. And honestly, I wish that I could just use an architecture like this, but our use case means that we kind of can't, and so we need to do something that is a little bit more complicated. But do not watch this video and start thinking, wow, this is really cool, or I want to do something like this because I want super fast speeds for people across the globe. I have made this mistake so many times where I've thought to myself, I need a fast server. I remember thinking about this with Quasarcast. Like, I want to build Quasarcast so it's fast everywhere in the world and it hits my API really quickly. Whereas in reality, Quasarcast just needs to be an SSR application that uses Cloudflare for some smart caching. Boom, job done. I don't need to think about all of this other complexity. That would just be ridiculous. Okay, so hopefully you found this useful. I enjoy talking about this stuff. Yeah, and hit me up on Discord if you want me to do a video on something that you're interested in. My Discord is Quasarcast. So if you add me on Discord there, and make sure that you're part of the Quasar Discord as well. So if you're a Quasar dev, if you head on over to quasardev.com and then click on this button, you can ask questions about Quasar. We got quite a few people that are actively answering questions there, which is really awesome. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one. Hello from Bolivia. Wow, cool. Hello from Australia. Yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this one. Add me on Discord if you want to chat, and I'll see you in a future live stream. Bye for now.